You know, when something pops up in the news and it just makes you stop and like say, wait, did I actually hear that right?
Happens all the time.
Well, that's exactly how I felt about this whole idea of sending American citizens to foreign prisons.
Yeah, that one definitely raises an eyebrow.
It sounds pretty wild, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's something former President Trump has been talking about quite, well, openly, shipping what he calls homegrown criminals overseas.
Right.
And it actually turns out there's already been some movement on this front, kind of, with deportations to El Salvador,
Hmm.
which, just brings up a whole load of questions.
It connects a few dots, or seems to.
Exactly. So for anyone listening in, if you're trying to sort of wrap your head around what's actually going on, well, you're in the right place.
So we're going to try and unpack it.
Yeah, we're going to do the deep dive into this, what exactly is being proposed, what are the big legal hurdles, and what's the real story with these recent deportations.
It really is quite something when you first hear it. And what's interesting, I think, is seeing this concept being, floated at the same time as these actual policy shifts, like the deportations, makes you wonder about the bigger picture, how these pieces might fit together, or if they do.
Definitely. So, okay, let's start with the talk itself. Trump, in that recent interview he did with Fox Noticias, he said he'd love to send these homegrown criminals.
That phrase itself, homegrown criminals.
Yeah. And he described them as Americans who grew up and something went wrong, sending them to prisons in other countries.
He wasn't vague about the kinds of crimes either, was he?
No, not at all.
Huh.
He painted a pretty grim picture. Talk about really violent acts, like hitting people with baseball bats, pushing people onto subway tracks. It's definitely language designed to get a reaction.
It is. And what's striking is his specific mention of El Salvador. He was really complimentary about President Bukele.
Right, and that huge prison.
Yeah. The Terrorism Confinement Center, CECOT, yeah. He claimed Bukele has made El Salvador very safe because of these, massive facilities.
Okay.
So if you look at the broader context, it kind of seems like he's suggesting Bukele's way of doing things could be a model, maybe, a solution for crime here.
Especially when he connects it to criminals he says were allowed to come in by Biden.
Right, tying it into the immigration debate, which is a whole other layer.
And it wasn't just that one interview either.
Yeah.
I remember he also mentioned, I think it was in the Oval Office, that he has no problem with deporting American homegrown criminals.
Oh, really? In the Oval Office?
Yeah. And that Pam Bondi, former AG of Florida,
All right, I remember her.
is apparently studying the laws on this.
Yeah.
That last bit really makes you think, okay, what laws, what kind of legal arguments could possibly be, considered to make this happen?
And that's exactly where things get really, really complex. Because almost right away, some major legal alarm bells start ringing. The whole idea of just sort of sending U.S. citizens off to another country's prison system runs up against some pretty fundamental constitutional limits.
Like what? What's the main one?
Well, the big one that springs to mind is a Supreme Court case from way back 1936, Valentine v. United States.
Okay, 1936. What did that say?
The court in that case made it crystal clear, really. A president cannot just extradite a U.S. citizen, period. Not without Congress passing a specific law that allows it.
Ah, okay, so it needs an act of Congress.
Precisely. That's a pretty significant legal barrier right there.
So just because a former president wants to do this, or even if his, legal team is digging into it, that doesn't automatically mean it's doable, given that Supreme Court precedent.
Correct. The Supreme Court ultimately decides what's constitutional. For this idea to actually move forward in any real sense, it would almost certainly need new legislation from Congress first.
Right.
And even then, that new law could still face its own legal challenges based on the Constitution itself.
And I guess it's not just about the extradition part, is it? There's also the Eighth Amendment.
Absolutely.
The one that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. We all remember that from civics class, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. And that's a huge factor. Sending an American citizen into a foreign prison system, well, the conditions there, their legal rights, could be drastically different from what they'd have in the U.S.
Right.
You could definitely argue that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under our standards.
So what one country thinks is okay for its prisons might just not fly under the U.S. Constitution.
Exactly. It might be seen as inhumane or excessively harsh by our legal standards. So even if they somehow found a way around the legal issues of physically sending people out of the country,
Which sounds tough already.
the Eighth Amendment would still be a really, really difficult hurdle to overcome.
Okay, so we've got this idea of sending citizens abroad and this, legal maze surrounding it. But you mentioned earlier, people have already been deported to El Salvador. Not citizens, but others. Can you walk us through that part?
Yes, definitely. So back in March, during the Trump administration, 238 men were deported. Most of them were actually from Venezuela, not El Salvador.
Okay.
And they were sent to that very same CECOT prison in El Salvador that Trump has been praising.
Wow. Okay. And what was the legal justification for that?
Well, the legal basis cited for many of these deportations was a, frankly, quite old piece of legislation. It's called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
1798.
Mm,
Seriously, that sounds like something straight out of a history book, not something used today.
It does, doesn't it? It's a very old law. It basically gives the president certain powers to detain and deport non-citizens during wartime, or if there's a declared national emergency related to, a conflict.
Huh. And was that challenged?
Well, initially, these deportations were carried out without a whole lot of judicial review, but the Supreme Court has had to weigh in on using this act in modern times.
Okay, what do they say?
They ruled that while, yes, the Alien Enemies Act can technically be used to deport people, even if they're, say, alleged gang members, those individuals are still entitled to due process.
Due process, meaning a fair legal procedure.
Exactly. You can't just bypass all the usual legal steps simply by invoking this old act or labeling someone. There needs to be some form of fair legal process involved.
Okay, that makes sense.
But this brings us to some really concerning details about who was actually on that plane to CCOT. There was a 60 Minutes investigation
Okay.
that looked into the backgrounds of those 238 men, and what they found was pretty startling, actually.
Startling how?
It turned out that a huge majority, I think about 75%, had no prior criminal records. None.
Wait. Three-quarters of them? No criminal record at all. And they were sent to this, like, Supermax-style prison in El Salvador.
That's what the 60 Minutes analysis found, yes. No prior convictions.
Wow. What about the other 25%?
Well, of the remaining group, about 22% did have some kind of record. But, get this, most of those were for non-violent offenses. Things like theft, shoplifting, trespassing.
So, not exactly the hardened criminals maybe implied.
Not for the most part, it seems. There were about a dozen who were accused of more serious crimes: murder, rape, assault, kidnapping. But the vast majority weren't in that category.
And the last few percent.
For about 3%, their records were unclear, according to the report.
That's a massive difference between the rhetoric about dangerous criminals and the reality, or at least the reported reality, of who was actually sent.
It certainly raises very serious questions. Questions about who was targeted for this, why them, and whether sending them to a prison like CCOT, which by all accounts has extremely harsh conditions, was proportionate or justified.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
And then there's that really troubling case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man from Maryland. His story seems to just highlight how wrong things can go.
It really does. He was living in Maryland, and he actually had protected status here in the U.S., but he was still deported to El Salvador.
With protected status, how did that happen?
The Justice Department itself actually admitted it was a mistake. They called it an administrative error.
An error. But he still ended up in CCOT.
He did. He had legal permission to be in the U.S., yet he was put on that plane and sent to El Salvador.
Unbelievable. So what happened then?
Well, the Supreme Court got involved in his case, and they ordered the Justice Department to take steps to bring him back, to facilitate his return.
Okay, so you'd think that would be it, right? The U.S. government says, oops, our bad. The highest court says, fix it. So they just bring him home. Simple.
You would think, but it hasn't been that straightforward at all.
Why not?
Well, Pam Bondi, who we mentioned earlier, was quoted saying something like, it's up to El Salvador if they want to return him.
Up to El Salvador,
Mm-hmm.
even though the U.S. deported him by mistake.
That was her reported stance. And then President Bukele himself has basically said he doesn't have the authority to just send Abrego Garcia back.
Yeah.
He apparently called the question preposterous and asked if he's supposed to, smuggle him into the United States.
That is bizarre.
Yeah.
So the U.S. admits the error, the Supreme Court orders a fix, but the country he was wrongly sent to is saying they can't or won't send him back.
Pretty much. It's a really strange and concerning diplomatic and legal limbo for Mr. Abrego Garcia.
It just really underscores how incredibly complicated these things get once you involve international borders and different legal systems, especially when individual rights are caught in the middle.
It absolutely does. It shows the limits, maybe, of U.S. legal power once someone is physically in another country's custody, even if they got there because of a U.S. error.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think hard about the protections and rights individuals ought to have in these kinds of cross-border situations.
Okay, so let's try and sort of pull this together. We have this idea being floated mainly by former President Trump, of sending American citizens accused of crimes to foreign prisons, with El Salvador held up as some kind of model.
Right, the homegrown criminals idea.
But there are these huge legal and constitutional roadblocks. That Valentine case about needing Congress for extradition, plus major questions around the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause.
Maybe hurdles, yeah.
And then, separate but related, we have the reality of actual deportations that already happened, sending non-citizens to that same prison in El Salvador using that very old Alien Enemies Act. But the reporting on who was sent raises serious due process flags, with many having no criminal record or only minor offenses.
A huge disconnect there, potentially.
Plus, this really worrying case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a legal resident deported by mistake and now stuck in limbo between countries.
Exactly. So you've got this kind of collision, right, between a very assertive, tough-on-crime political rhetoric, the actual constraints and framework of the U.S. legal system,
Right.
and then the very real, sometimes tragic human consequences of these policies when they're put into practice, as we see with the deportations and Mr. Abrego Garcia's situation.
So when you stack all of that up, the legal barriers for citizens, the due process questions for non-citizens already deported, the sheer concept of sending Americans abroad for punishment, it really makes you step back and think, doesn't it?
It does.
What does all this mean for the legal rights of, well, everyone, both citizens and non-citizens? And maybe, what does it tell us about how our society's thinking about crime and punishment might be shifting or being pushed to shift?
Yeah, those are the big questions, aren't they? There are definitely a lot of different perspectives and angles to consider here.
And some potentially massive implications down the line.
Yeah.
It feels very much like this is a story that's still developing, still unfolding.
Definitely one to keep an eye on.